Hi everyone. In this video, we are going to talk about the properties of inequalities. So let's get started. Suppose we are given two real numbers, let's say A and B. So we are given two real numbers A and B. Now what can be the possible relationships between these two numbers? If you think about it, there are actually only three possibilities. One possibility is that A is equal to B, or A could be greater than B, or A could be less than B. Now, can you think of any other possibility? Actually, there are no other possibilities. Those are the only three possible relationship between two real numbers. Either they're equal or one is greater than the other one, right? And this is called the trichotomy principle. So let me first highlight this. And this is known as trichotomy principle. In the trichotomy principle, as you can see, there is one relationship for equality and there are two other relationships for inequality. And in this video, we are going to talk about some of the properties of the inequality relationship. So, the first property that we are going to discuss is like this. So, if A is greater than B, we have two real numbers. We are talking about two real numbers. If A is greater than B, that will imply that B is less than A. Similarly, if A is less than B, that will imply that B is greater than A. And you can try with any arithmetic number, you can clearly see that yes, it is true. I mean, if 2 is greater than 1, then obviously 1 is less than 2. Similarly, if 2 is less than 5, then 5 is greater than 2, right? The second property says if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, wherever I put a comma here, that's for AND, it's not for OR, it's for AND. So you want to read it like this: if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, which is another real number. So now we have three real numbers, A, B and C. From here we can say that A is greater than C. Similarly, if we say A is less than B and B is less than C, then we can say A is also less than C. Now let's talk about the third property. It says if A is greater than B and C is any real number, then we can say that A plus C will also be greater than B plus C. And also A minus C will be greater than B minus C. So adding the same real number on both sides of an inequality does not change the inequality relationship. Similarly, subtracting the same real number from both sides of an inequality does not change the relationship of the inequality. Now let's talk about the fourth property. The fourth property says that if A is greater than B and C is greater than D, so now we are talking about four real numbers A, B, C and D. So A is greater than B and C is greater than D, then we can say that A plus C will be greater than B plus D. And similarly, if A is less than B and C is less than D, then we can say that A plus C will be less than B plus D. Now let's talk about the next property. Property number 5. It says that for any positive real number C, so if C is greater than 0, then we can say a couple of things. Suppose if A is greater than B, it would mean that A times C will also be greater than B times C, and also A divided by C will be greater than B divided by C, as long as C is a positive real number. And similarly, if we have A less than B, then again we get two similar relationships here. A times C will be less than B times C, and similarly A divided by C will also be less than B divided by C. Now let's talk about the sixth property. This is a very important property, and it says that for a negative real number C, so if you have C less than 0, then we can talk about a couple of things. Now if A is greater than B, that would mean that A times C will be less than B times C. The sign of inequality will change because we are multiplying both sides of an inequality by a negative number. This is very important. When multiplying or dividing by a negative number, then the sign of inequality will change. We started with A greater than B, and now here we have A times C less than B times C. And similarly, A divided by C will also be less than B divided by C, because in this case C is a negative real number. And similarly, if we have A less than B, so now let's talk about this scenario, A less than B. When A is less than B, we can say that A times C will be greater than B times C. The sign of inequality will change. Similarly, we can say A divided by C will be greater than B divided by C. And if we multiply both sides of an inequality by a negative 1, for example, if we say suppose we have A greater than B, here if we multiply both sides of the inequality by negative 1, A becomes negative A and B becomes negative B, and the sign of inequality will change. It will become less than. You can take an example. So suppose we have 2 greater than 1, but if you consider negative 2 and negative 1, we know that negative 1 is greater than negative 2. You see how the sign of inequality is changing? Now let's talk about the seventh property. For the seventh property, it says that if A times B is greater than 0, meaning if the product of A and B is greater than 0, that means both A and B have the same sign. If you think about it, let's take an example. Suppose A is 2. So if we say A is 2 and B is 3, from here we can say that A times B is equal to 6, which is obviously greater than 0. Now if we say A is negative 2 and B is negative 3, then also A times B comes out to be negative 2 times negative 3, negative times negative will be positive, so again positive 6, which is greater than 0. Now if we take A as negative 2 and B as 3, then the product will be negative. It will be negative 6, which is less than 0, right? Similarly, if you change the sign of B, so if you take A as positive 2 and B as negative 3, then also A times B will be, well, it will be equal to negative 6, which is less than 0, right? So from the example you can see, to have the product positive, their sign has to be same. Either both of them are positive or both of them are negative. Now, if the product is negative, then they have opposite signs, right? If the product is negative, they have opposite signs. So I'm going to erase this, and I'm going to quickly write down here, if the product which is A times B is negative, that means A and B have opposite signs. Now let's talk about the eighth property. The eighth property says that if A and B have the same sign, when A and B have the same sign, right? If A is greater than B, it would also imply that their reciprocal, which is 1 over A and 1 over B, their reciprocal will be in a reverse relation. So if A is greater than B, then their reciprocal 1 by A will be less than 1 by B. And similarly, if A is less than B, then the reciprocal will be in the opposite relationship. So 1 by A will be greater than 1 by B. Now let's talk about the ninth property, which says if we have two positive real numbers, say A is positive and B is also positive, and A is greater than B, and they both are greater than 0. That means they both are positive and also A is greater than B, right? Then from here we can say that A raised to any positive power will be greater than B raised to the same positive power when n is positive. And if we have A and B both negative, say suppose A is less than 0 and B is also less than 0, and then if we have A greater than B, from here we can say that A raised to the power n will be less than B raised to the power n when n is positive but even. It's a positive even number. And we can say that A to the power n will be greater than B to the power n when n is positive and it's an odd number. Now let's talk about the 10th property. The 10th property says that the square of any real number can never be negative. It's always greater than or equal to 0. So if I simply write A is a real number, any real number, whether it's a positive real number, negative real number, or even 0, the square of any real number is always greater than or equal to 0. It is never a negative number, and this is extremely important. We need to highlight this particular property of real number, and in some sense it is also it gives us a nice inequality, right? And using this property, there are n number of proofs that can be done in the inequality chapter, right? So when you go to the inequalities concepts and proofs, this property will be used extensively. And there is one little 11th property. Let's quickly talk about that. So property number 11 will be like this. If A is positive and n is greater than 1, right, then the whole of A will be greater than any of its parts. So A divided by n will be one part of A, and that part will always be less than the whole A. In other words, A is greater than any of its parts, right? This is also another important inequality that we need to make a note, and this also comes very handy when proving inequalities concepts. So this brings us to the end of this video. I hope everything made sense. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.